The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will...
Order, order. Welcome to this evidence session from the Home Affairs Select Committee, and we welcome to give evidence to us today Dame Cressida Dick, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Service, and Assistant Commissioner Louisa Rolfe. Thank you very much for joining us as part of our intermittent evidence sessions on the work of the Commissioner. We're very grateful for your time this afternoon. Can I begin? You'll be aware we're obviously conducting an inquiry into the IOPC, to the police complaints and conduct system at the moment. So we wanted to begin by asking you particularly around some of the issues that the Metropolitan Police has faced and in particular Operation Midland. Can I ask you just to begin with, how far have you now implemented the recommendations of the Henriquez report?
Chair, and thank you for having us here this afternoon. I would like to start by saying again how very, very sorry I am at the awful, horrible impact that Midland had on a number of individuals. I have apologised personally to Lord Bramwell and Lady Britton. I've listened to their testament, if you like, and I know Lady Britton was here in front of this committee not long ago. And it is hard to hear what they say. There were many mistakes made in Midland. My job as Commissioner has been to make sure that we reduce as far as we possibly can the risk of any similar mistakes in the future. And I'm very pleased with the progress that we have made. You may possibly be aware, I don't expect you to have absorbed it, but in the public domain as of yesterday is a comprehensive detail of all the recommendations in Sir Richard's report, where we've got to with those, and indeed where we've got to with the Her Majesty's Inspectorate report and the Independent Office of Police Conduct report. And I can say with some confidence that I believe we have transformed the way we deal with a number of different issues in the Met. I set up an operation called Larimar under a Deputy Assistant Commissioner, and they have, with a team, really driven forward a huge change in the way in which we deal with search warrants, in terms of applications and indeed the execution of the warrant. We have critically changed a number of our processes in relation to how we work with the media, and that very important point about identifying people, particularly people with a high public profile. We have implemented some significant changes in the way in which we investigate and go about investigations of historic child sexual abuse and associated investigations. And we've changed the way we communicate with people who are regarded at that point as possible or actual suspects. A very important point that you will be aware of is that we have made it extremely clear to all of our staff what we expect from them when they take a report from an individual, a victim of such a crime. And you may know this is agreed nationally. It's very similar to the phrases that I used when I became Commissioner. We will believe a victim such that we record the crime allegation. From that point on, we will investigate impartially and with an open mind to establish the facts. So I think that we have made some very substantial changes, that we have made some massive progress in terms of implementing all of the recommendations, and I hope that that will go some way to reassure people who undoubtedly, many people were very concerned about what happened in the public, in the judiciary, and of course, very importantly, those people who are most impacted by this, that they can have and should have confidence in the way the Met would work today and would deal with a similar allegation in the future.
Thank you. Tim Lawton.
Commissioner, you just said that you published yesterday your responses to the Henriquez recommendations that we may be aware of. I wasn't aware of that. Is it a coincidence that they were published the day before you were due to appear in front of this committee where the subject was going to come up, given that it's now more than 5 years since Henriquez was commissioned to make that report by your predecessor?
Of course, this isn't the first time we've published updates. Indeed, there's been a publicly available set of updates for some time on our websites. But the Home Office yesterday published my letter to Sir Richard, which was in response to a letter from the Home Secretary, I believe, the Home Secretary having given some commitments at this committee. So that sort of explains that bit of timing. My point is this is simply the latest, and it was published yesterday. It's very, very comprehensive.
Okay. And alas, I and other members of the committee have not seen it, which leaves us at something of a disadvantage. You will have seen the evidence given by Lady Britton and others, which is deeply alarming. Can I just ask you, what was your role in Operation Midland? Because that's not been clear.
So, Operation Midland started, as you know, in 2014, and I was the Assistant Commissioner, Specialist Crime and Operations, until the end of 2014. The lead for Operation Midland, as you know, was Deputy Assistant Commissioner Steve Rodhouse, and in the period before I left the Met, just at the beginning of 2015, I was his line manager.
So the operation was set up in March of 2014, at which point you were the Assistant Commissioner in charge of Specialist Crime and Operations. So were you integral in the setting up of Operation Midland?
So I was fully aware that some allegations had been made, and I appointed Steve Rodhouse, having consulted with the Commissioner of the day, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe at that point. I appointed him to lead in relation to these allegations and a whole series of other historic child sexual abuse allegations.
So how closely did DAC Rodhouse report to you then whilst you were in that position?
So Midland itself was launched later in the year, and DAC Rodhouse kept me periodically updated throughout the period that I was there. And as I say, I was his line manager. But he was a very senior officer, and he was in overall charge of all of these matters.
He reported to you, so
Absolutely.
you had an oversight of it all. So were you in post when Carl Beech was first interviewed?
He first interviewed in the Met. No, I wasn't. Well, hang on. I need to double check, actually. I'm sorry. When the first allegations came in, I certainly was. There will have been ongoing interviews. I was around when the first allegations came in.
You were in that position when Carl Beech was first interviewed, and presumably DAC Rodhouse would have reported back to you, given that this was such a high profile.
Yes, indeed, yes.
So you were fully aware of the Beech interviews and the allegation that Beech was making, and therefore you raised no concerns when another senior officer described those allegations as credible and true?
So I was aware. I was not involved in the planning for the press conference when that was said, but I was fully aware of the allegations. Absolutely.
So you agreed that they were credible and true?
No, I supported the launch of Operation Midland. I believed that these matters did need investigating, and I still believe they needed investigating, and I'm sure you'll be aware that Sir Richard Henriques also believed they needed investigating, and so I think actually did Lord Bramall. So I believe they needed investigating at that point in the autumn of 2014.
So I don't think that's the answer I'm after. Were the allegations credible and true? Because you're later reported as saying that you winced when you heard those words, credible and true.
I did wince when they were said. What I knew was that several of the officers who had been dealing with Carl Beach, who was, I think anybody would agree if you were to read the transcripts or to see the interviews, was a very, very, very accomplished liar. I think Sir Richard agrees with that in many respects, i.e. he was able to lie sort of in a credible manner. I knew that the officers who'd first spoken to him felt that in their first impressions that from their point of view they felt this was true. Now clearly there were aspects of what was being said which were very hard to believe at one level, and secondly, absolutely, these allegations, these things that he was saying needed to be tested, and so they should have been. So I did.
With respect, Commissioner,
yeah.
The police deal quite a lot with people who are incredibly good liars.
For sure.
Many criminals are pretty good at it. Carl Beach seemed to have been particularly good at it.
Yes.
But that's your business. It's dealing with people who tell you, no, it wasn't me.
Yes, that's why it needs investigating. Yes.
Absolutely needs to be investigated. Yeah. But then to bring it up to now, because we're now 7 years on from when you oversaw the setting up of Operation Midland, mm-hmm. We're now 5 years on from when your successor commissioned the Henriques review, which was only recently published, and it was suppressed. And then we had the evidence from Lady Britain, who has suffered, as her late husband did, for all those years, and you quite rightly, you've said you've apologised, we acknowledge that, and acknowledge the huge hurt that has been caused to those accused and their families. Yeah. And yet, just a couple of months ago, when she gave evidence, and in a very extensive and very impersonal interview which Lady Britain gave in the Mail, Lady Britain said, and just to give some quotes, "I've always believed that a strong moral compass is essential to every public body, and especially to police forces. However, it just seems to me that the Metropolitan Police has preferred its corporate or personal ambition to a strong moral compass. Not a single person in this case has resigned, lost their job, been fired, demoted or disciplined. Nobody whatsoever. There's been a little bit of hand-wringing, which doesn't amount to a row of beans. Police appear to have a culture which is cover up and flick away." Those are the recent words of Lady Britain, who has not been reassured by your apologies, your approaches, your predecessors, or any of the reports that have come out. That is her impression of the police now on your watch. How do you react to that?
Well, you've said a lot of things there. I'll focus on Lady Britain's comments. I don't agree with everything you said before that, but in terms of Lady Britain's comments, she's entirely entitled, of course, to her view. I do not believe that we have lost our moral compass. Personally, I absolutely don't. I don't believe that anything has been covered up. Indeed, my predecessor brought in Sir Richard, who did a very extensive piece of work. Then it was referred, as you know, to the Independent Office of Police Conduct, who have done another investigation. And we have responded strongly to all the recommendations from those three parties. I say again, Lady Britain, I cannot possibly put myself in her shoes. She has been through a terrible, terrible set of experiences. I'm very sorry.
But Commissioner, again, my concern is that all those years on, all these terrible revelations, the reports we've had from Henriques, Her Majesty's Inspectorate, what the Home Office is trying to find out, there still appears to be a degree of denial about what actually went on and whether things are really now fit for purpose. So Richard Henriques, a highly eminent QC, commissioned by your predecessor to do this report, which you then sat on. So as the HMIC report said, senior officers have been preoccupied with restricting access to the Henriques report. And they've found that the Metropolitan Police, under your watch again, had no plan to enact the reforms, took an underwhelming approach, I quote, to learning the lessons, and did almost nothing for 3.5 years. And at the same time as Lady Britain's interview in the Mail, and thank goodness the Mail has uncovered and revealed all of the full horror of this stuff. So Richard Henriques has said, confidence in our process has been gravely damaged. The operation was conducted in a disordered and chaotic manner and was littered with mistakes, all of which could and should have been avoided by officers who were subsequently promoted. So far as I know, not one of my recommendations has either been accepted or rejected by the Metropolitan Police. It's over 4 years and 4 months since I handed my review to Lord Hogan how I'm dismayed at the delay in acting upon my recommendations. That was fewer than 3 months ago. This isn't historic stuff. So the person that your predecessor commissioned to look into this properly is far from happy that you and your force are really taking these allegations seriously. It's not historic anymore. Contemporaneously, you're not really getting it. Who's wrong?
Well, again, you've made a lot of statements there. I can't possibly deal with all of them. I don't agree with all of them. But if I go to Sir Richard's comments, I think the evidence is clear that we have, as I've said, I won't repeat it, thoroughly responded and thoroughly changed our way of doing things. I'm extremely confident in our ability now, through a whole variety of things, to give much higher assurance in relation to our applications for search warrants, our execution of search warrants, the way in which we will deal with the media, the way in which we would investigate a crime like this. Now, I have had a meeting with Sir Richard. I've spoken to him on the phone, and at that first meeting in, I think, 2019, I ran through with him where we were with our recommendations. And since then, there has been, months and months and months ago, on a publicly available website, the updated where we are with the various recommendations. So I think we have been pushing on. We've made some enormous changes, and we have been transparent about those changes. Now, the early criticism, and you quoted the HMI there, our take was, as I understand it, and some of this, of course, precedes me, but our take was that until the Beach trial was finished and the IOPC had finished their work, we needed to be careful about making wholesale changes. And many of the changes that we made were dependent on the National Police Chiefs Council, on the College of Policing, or on the Home Office. And they have, I can absolutely assure you, and I'd be delighted for you to come in and have a look, as I have offered to Sir Richard recently and previously, and indeed to other parties. Come and have a look and see what we're doing and how we've done it, and you will find no shortage of determination to change and to be transparent about that change.
I'm sure the committee would like to take up that that invitation. I'm sure the committee would like to have had a more detailed list of exactly what has been done before then, because I can only go on what those who have been closest to this investigation, of which Sir Richard Henriques is one of the closest, that a matter of weeks ago clearly was very unhappy with the attitude still being taken by the police and the progress, or lack of it as he sees it, that was being made. And when you, in an interview in the Times, in response to all of these allegations, said your officers who led Operation Midland did their very best. Well, if they did, then you've got some officers who should not be working for the Met. And the concern is that not a single officer has suffered any consequences, any demotion, any sacking. Many have been promoted who were clearly culpable in the whole of this. And one perhaps final thing, Commissioner, again, Sir Richard Henriques particularly pointed to witnesses A and B, currently being investigated, I gather, by Merseyside Police, who you have referred to them to review this, but on the Met's own terms. Witnesses A and B who took the decision, who corroborated Beech's claims when they came forward in September 2015, were clearly lying, and clearly, according to Richard Henriques, should be referred for perverting the course of justice. Why hasn't that happened? Who's responsible for not referring them for criminal charges?
Again, a lot of issues there. In relation to officers and nobody, as you say, having been subject to proceedings.
I'm in the middle.
As you know, the Independent Office of Police Conduct conducted a totally independent investigation, and we referred those officers to them to do that, and they took some time and they did a detailed investigation, and you know the results of that. Sir Richard himself described the officers as having conducted this investigation in a conscientious manner and with propriety and honesty. That's a strong statement, and it was obviously what he felt at that time. In terms of...
He subsequently regretted having made, because you have used it as an excuse to whitewash all the criticisms which he has made, and he said so.
Well, I can't speak for what Sir Richard thinks or why he said what he said. I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment any further on that. In relation to A and B, my sense is that a very well-articulated decision was made. We've put something in the public domain about this. However, we have referred this to another force for them to review it. In effect,
responsible for A and B not having been referred for prosecution. Does that fall to you as well?
Well, as far as the reason I'm here is because I'm the Commissioner, and I am ultimately accountable for what happens in the Met. So I'm absolutely content to say, I can't remember the exact date that decision was made, but I'm here because I'm the Commissioner.
So you're defending the decision that you did not ask for witnesses A and B to be referred for criminal charges on the basis of what their lies has resulted in?
I think we should wait for the outcome of the other force.
Final point. When 6 former Home Secretaries said that the inquiry, Operation Midland and everything else that goes with it, has harmed faith in the police, do you agree with them?
I think that Midland undoubtedly, first of all, had a huge impact on many individuals, as I have said, and I regret that. And secondly, in a number of ways, and for many people, yes, it harmed people's sense of their confidence in the police service generally, but in particular in the Met. That is why I have set about trying to make sure that we never have anything like this again, and that our systems, our processes, our training, our officers' understanding, right across the board. We've trained nearly 25,000 officers in a completely different and better way to think about search warrants. We've brought in a whole series of different systems. And I absolutely, I want the Metropolitan Police to be the most trusted police service in the world. I said that when I arrived. I think this has damaged people's trust to some extent, and we need to carry on making sure that nothing like this happens again.
One last point I meant to ask you on. You promoted Deputy Assistant Commissioner Matt Horne to be your head of professional standards in the Met, despite the fact that when he was the Deputy Chief Constable at Essex, he was found guilty of misconduct and for bullying and threatening staff, and indeed there's a CPS decision pending over possible criminal issues with that. Was that a wise choice?
So he was not promoted, but he came to the Met after the hearing that you've talked about. He had been found, as you know, in relation to misconduct. That is not something which should or does impede people's appointment, or depending on the circumstances, of course, but as a generality, it doesn't impede people moving or having a further appointment, or indeed potentially being promoted, although I must say he was not promoted. And he has been doing he is a very capable man, and he's been doing an excellent job since he has been in the Met.
He left that position now, hasn't he?
He's working in our Transformation Directorate.
You made him the head of professional standards, so a level of integrity and reputation is probably needed higher than average. So you still don't regret having put somebody in that position with that background, given all the very sensitive issues contemporaneously going on associated with Operation Midland and the behaviour of other officers under your command?
I say again, he's done an extremely good job. He's a very talented person, somebody who has been found in relation to misconduct is entitled to obviously that's not something where you can lose your job. They're entitled to carry on with their job, and they're entitled to carry on delivering and performing as somebody who, as he is, in my view, has done an extremely good job on behalf of the public of London. And I made that decision absolutely with my eyes open, and yes, I stand by it, and I stand by him.
Thank you, Chair.
We may have some further questions on some of the detail in writing once we've had a chance to go thoroughly through the letter, the copy of the letter that you have sent to Richard Henriquez, which is has further detail in it. But the reason that we are keen to pursue this with you is obviously partly because this was such an awful case and things went so badly wrong, as you have recognised, and we've heard from Lady Britain just how painful and how difficult that was, and in particular them also not having any further information before Lady Britain's husband died as well. And so the awful experience is there, but that's what also makes it so shocking that it took so long for any further follow-up action to be taken in terms of implementing the Henriquez report. And that raises the wider issues for us that have come up time and time again as part of our inquiry, that when problems are raised, perhaps through the IOPC, perhaps through the HMIC, there isn't actually a system for proper follow-up to make sure that recommendations are actually implemented in practice. So why really, if you even just take the example of the search warrants, why did it take 3 years from 2016 to 2019 for proper action to be taken to address the problem with search warrants that Richard Henriquez had identified?
It would be wrong to suggest that no actions had been taken. There had been a number, but as I say, I think people were being cautious because they didn't want to prejudice the trial of Carl Beach, and they didn't want to prejudge what the IOPC would come up with.
But I just don't see... I think you need to explain that to me, because I can't see why those two things would prevent you putting in place proper training on the application of search warrants. The problem that had been identified was that officers were not getting proper training, were not properly understanding the evidence base, the things that they needed to have in place to lawfully get a search warrant. I just don't see why sorting that problem out would somehow prejudice the trial or prejudice the IOPC investigation. They seem to be completely unrelated.
So a number of changes were made, including in relation to search warrants, but I absolutely acknowledge that the huge change that we've made in the last 18 months or 2 years is a big step forward. So, for example, we've brought in a new computerised system for all search warrants, which is linked neatly to the courts.
Then let me interrupt you briefly on that point then. What's the good reason why that couldn't have been done in 2016 straight after the Henriques report?
I wasn't there when it first landed, but my sense, as I say, is there were these great big other things happening, and the IOPC very specifically were looking at the issues of search warrants and how we ought to respond to that. And we largely, not entirely, I had a spreadsheet when I arrived as Commissioner of all the different changes that had been made, but we wanted to see what else they would suggest. And that has led to this full-time team, really a large team, going at it right across. We're a big organisation. Bringing in a new system sounds easy, isn't as easy as all that. And bringing in new training for everybody, bringing in new supervision, training up all your inspectors. We've changed thousands of those, bringing in whole sets of practice and policy.
And that all sounds very good, and that all sounds very sensible to provide everybody with training in an area where clearly training had been flawed previously and there was clearly a gap in people's knowledge. But again, it just is really hard to understand why it would take 3 years to start training. Completely understand that you might have kept things open, that you might need to further amend things once more information came through. But once you'd had this big gap identified, I appreciate that some of this, predates your time and so on, but it is very hard for us to understand why police forces as institutions don't have systems in place to make sure when you have such a big report as the Henriques report, such a big failing as the Operation Midland, there aren't systems in place to make sure that follow-up action is taken swiftly.
So I don't totally agree with the HMI report, but I do accept that what we've done since has been, real systemic change, given a huge boost, if you like, by the although started, but the later changes started before the IOPC report really landed, but a huge boost by both the HMI and the IOPC, and indeed what we have done has changed national practice. And we've worked really closely, as I said, with the College of Policing, National Police Chiefs Council, and we have kind of led the way with that. But it would be wrong for me to suggest, absolutely wrong for me to suggest, that nothing was happening before that. Of course there was already training for people in how to do search warrants. There was already a system, a paper-based system. There was already levels of supervision expected. And I'm just talking about search warrants. There could be a whole series of other things that I could talk about. It was not that nothing happened after Sir Richard's report landed. It's just that once Beech's trial had finished, once the IPC report was about to arrive, then it really was turbocharged by me personally to say this is a matter of public confidence and we really, really, really need to show what we are doing here, and we need to change things very fast.
But if it took 3 years before something where there was a clear recommendation, clearly high profile, clearly a problem, and it took 3 years for that turbocharging, for that serious implementation to take place, what hope can there be that less high profile reports will be implemented, that less high-profile recommendations from either the IOPC or the HMIC will ever be implemented in practice? And the reason I'm pushing you on this is because time and again we have heard from cases where reports have been done, recommendations have been made, and police forces, not just yourselves, but all across the country, have simply not implemented them, and they've sat on a shelf. If such a high-profile report could sit on a shelf, what confidence can we have that other reports' recommendations will be implemented?
So I say again, it's not that nothing happened, and I'd be delighted to write to you to explain what did happen in that interim period. It would be wrong for me to suggest that everybody just sat and waited. No. In relation to every single recommendation that we accepted or partially accepted, there was movement. But it has subsequently been turbocharged. And your point is well made. I set out, as my strategy as Commissioner is to ensure that we really do learn. We learn from the good and the bad, and it's a core part of our strategy. And I have Helen Ball, my Assistant Commissioner of Professionalism, who is in charge of our, amongst other things, our organisational learning. And we have put in place a whole series of processes to make sure that where we should, we do absolutely get onto and quickly implementing our recommendations. Now, you will be aware that we are subject to thousands, actually, I'm not exaggerating, of recommendations every year from coroners, from the IOPC, from the HMI, from a variety of other bodies, regulatory, accountability bodies, and sometimes just random bodies, all of whom think what they need to do is this and this and this. We can't necessarily do all of those things, and certainly not all at the same time, and sometimes we don't agree with the recommendation. We didn't agree with all of Sir Richard's recommendations. But I absolutely take your point. This was a very important case. You can be assured that things have changed hugely now, and you can be assured that we have a process in place to make sure that when significant recommendations land, we get onto them. And the governance that goes right up to me chairing the management board is very, very strong on that.
Do you have a list of all of the IOPC and HMIC reports and their recommendations that have come out for the Met, say even over the last 2 years, and the recommendations that you've accepted that have not yet been implemented?
I don't have it with me, but I could certainly show you those. Yes, but
there is a list.
Yes,
there is a system that exists
absolutely,
that takes account that has a list of all of the different recommendations and whether they've been implemented or not.
We have a risk and assurance board. Sorry to talk in boring governance terms, but we have a risk and assurance board whose job it is to make sure that we are implementing the key recommendations. And as I say, we can't do all of them. We don't accept all of them. And we don't do all of them at the same time, but we absolutely keep on top of that. And it would include, for example, audit recommendations. And I should point out that several of our, and indeed, the Investigatory Powers Commissioner recommendations, various other things like that, several of our regulatory bodies have commented on the way in which we govern that kind of thing.
That would be really helpful. It would be really helpful to have just a list of the reports and the numbers of recommendations that have either been implemented or not been implemented, and your monitoring processes for following those would be immensely helpful.
And IOPC.
The HMIC and IOPC, and if there is any other additional significant category that you think should be treated in the same way, then that would be really helpful as well. Thank you. We need to move on. We wanted to move on to some of the issues raised around the policing of the vigil at Clapham Common. Can I go to Simon Fowle?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for joining us as well and for your time. I'd like to start with the policing plan for the vigil on the 13th of March. Could you describe how you factored in the gendered nature of this process into that plan? And I'm asking in particular because we've had quite a lot of evidence, both written and in the sessions that we held in person, where people spoke about a good number of male police officers joining the protest and trying to disperse the protests as well. So I'm interested in your view in that and why there were so many male officers there that evening.
Well, thank you very much. A couple of introductory comments about the vigil that you're referring to. Firstly, to say we were utterly outraged at the murder of Sarah Everard. And we recognised just how upset and angry so many people in London and well beyond were. My colleagues felt betrayed and appalled at what appeared as alleged to have happened. And I think if you look at our documentation, you can see that there was a real sense of the sensitivities that there would be in relation to this proposed vigil. You'll remember we were policing during the pandemic, Wave 2, Tier 4 regulations, and you'll be aware that those regulations had changed many, many times over the previous year and sometimes had appeared to members of the public at least somewhat ambiguous. My officers had been wrestling throughout the year with events and protests and public order matters in those various different regulations. I think that, as the HMI report says, and I would commend it to you, we found ourselves in a very complex position and in some senses an invidious position that day. You'll be aware that we had been, during, let's say, for this purpose, Tier 4, every day we had been dispersing events and or protests. We had been issuing tickets occasionally. We'd made arrests. We'd had officers injured. Sadly, in upholding that law, in upholding those regulations in the pandemic, we had to disperse people at funerals, at weddings, at wakes, at parties, and, as you know, a huge number of gatherings of various sorts, unlicensed music events, as an example. That very day, we attended 2 other vigils. One was of a murder victim, and we dispersed the people there after they had gathered and come together in a tight crowd for a protracted period. And another was in relation to a Tamil person who had died, where, after the crowd would not disperse, we, having gone through our 3 E's, and indeed given some time before that dispersal, we had used enforcement action. I say all this because I want you to know that my officers take no pleasure in this. It is our job to uphold the law. It is our job to keep people safe. We were, and indeed are, in a pandemic at a very, very difficult time. We would much rather not be stopping people having their fun or expressing themselves or gathering for whatever purpose. But that was the job, to be able to uphold the regulations. And nobody wanted the outcome that we saw. I'm sure we will answer more questions about the vigil and the HMI report, no doubt. But in terms of the gendered nature, as you say, you may be aware that we had about 6 hours of people on Clapham Common that afternoon coming in 1s and 2s, small household groups, to lay flowers. And we had a very low-key police presence there. And those were mostly local neighbourhood officers. But there were a large number of women amongst them. And the officers who attended and dealt with what eventuated when the peaceful, respectful vigil turned into a very densely packed and large gathering, more like a protest rally than a vigil. Male and female have been commended in the HMI report for their thoughtfulness, their sensibleness, their proportionality, the way in which they took a very proportionate approach, the way they stayed very calm in the face of vile abuse, and their patience. Indeed, you'll be aware that the HMI looked at body-worn video extensively, and they described under really difficult circumstances exemplary conduct by the officers, and absolutely no evidence of heavy-handedness whatsoever, despite watching hours of body-worn video. But I personally did consider, and I know my Gold Commander did consider the day before, I did yesterday, the day before, I can't say when he did exactly, whether there was an argument for creating, it's been suggested since, hasn't it, that everything would be better and different if we'd had all-female police support units, as we call them, the public order trained officers. And 2 issues. One, not practical for us to do that, certainly at such short notice. And secondly, hugely divisive amongst my people, and I've subsequently taken a straw poll, and men and women alike are really not keen on this idea that when you have a primarily female rally or protest, that we will send only women in to deal with that. I know some people might wish to debate that, but what I can say is it was considered, It was not practical, and we didn't do it. It would be wrong to say that there was an unusual number of men there. Far from it. It was proportionate to our public order resources.
Thank you. The witnesses we had speak to us spoke about a point in the evening where the tone of the vigil shifted, and it went from being a peaceful protest, as you say, people going ones and twos, to a gathering crowd number where your officers then decided to take action. And the people who we spoke to who were stood on the bandstand couldn't identify what the motivating moment was for those officers to come forward and for that action to be taken. I'm interested in your view as to what that shift was and why they decided to take action at that point.
I'll bring Louisa in if that's all right, but just to save my voice. We're both equally well versed, but Louisa is the Assistant Commissioner for that bit of the business.
Thank you, Commissioner. So the HMIC took a detailed look at this point in particular, and they described officers for some 90 minutes patiently pleading with people who were on the bandstand, chanting and refusing to leave. And the Gold Commander and the Silver Commander's log as to decisions made were very clear that there was a clear strategy of engaging and encouraging people to disperse. Some of that was successful. Certainly when the crowd gathered at just before 6 p.m. to nearly 1,500, quite tightly packed around the bandstand, a great number of people were receptive to police engagement and encouragement and did disperse, but there were a small number surrounded by still quite a large crowd on the bandstand who, despite nearly 90 minutes as described by HMIC of patiently pleading, did not. And therefore it's quite clear when you look at the decision log of the commanders in charge of the event that the point was reached where the public could not be kept safe without officers actively removing those individuals.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I should say the report does make that absolutely clear. Last question from me then is around communications on the day itself. And the report does make clear that there were gaps between what the Silver Command knew and what the Gold Command knew, and the messages that were being passed backwards and forwards between them. So this was around the number of people in the event, whether there was a PA system or not on the bandstand. Those feel like essential pieces of information for you to know to be able to police effectively. So what lessons have you learned from this, and how will you be changing your practice as a result of it?
So we take all of that incredibly seriously, and as discussed previously on other matters with the committee, we do any HMIC report recommendation, we ensure that we address effectively, but in addition we are holding a formal debrief of the vigil and the policing of the vigil with our teams to ensure that any point of learning is logged and that we take a very active approach to addressing it in our future operations. But HMIC were very clear in their assessment of this, that they identified a number of points of learning for us, but all of those in total were well within the bounds of what goes well or less well in any policing operation. So they certainly did not identify that those were matters that would have fundamentally changed the outcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Diane Abbott. Diane, I think you might still be on mute.
Thank you very much, Chair.
I can hear you.
The Metropolitan Police will be aware that people up and down the country were shocked at the scenes they saw of police handling the women on the vigil. And one of the things that stakeholders have said to us is that local stakeholders, notably the local police, believed the vigil would go ahead anyway, and the focus should be on enabling it to go ahead lawfully. But I understand that advice was rejected by senior officers at Scotland Yard. Is it true you rejected the advice of local police, and why did you do so?
No, it's not true. And Louisa may want to supplement what I say, but you talked about people being shocked by the images, and I absolutely understand that some people were, upset by them. I would underline again that the HMI report points out how well the officers conducted themselves at the time, and that they were not heavy-handed at all, and that they took a very proportionate approach, and they didn't rush in. They spent a long time, as Louisa has said, trying to explain and engage and encourage people to behave differently. I understand at one point an independent person asked everybody to leave, and that just resulted in huge increase in kind of abuse towards the police, and a really clear statement from some people on the bandstand that nobody was going anywhere. It's important to remember that, as far as I'm aware, nobody at that event was injured. We had a number of arrests, it is true, but at 9, I think, 7 were de-arrested very, very fast when they gave their names and addresses, which obviously they had been asked to give on a multiple occasions before, but they had refused. So I don't regard it as heavy-handed action, far from it, actually. Now, in terms of going ahead or not going ahead, again, I would refer you to the HMI report. They say, they ask the question, is there any way that this could have been planned for as a more COVID-friendly event? Could it have gone ahead, in effect? And they come to the conclusion that no, because once the organisers had publicised, as they did, hugely the fact that this thing might happen, we knew that there would be several thousand. It was clear there were several thousand people intent on coming, even the day before. And probably that would have multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. And the focal point was the bandstand. And the individuals who wanted to organise this event did not, in the view of our Gold Commander, have the capability at all to be able, at such short notice, to ensure that people didn't come in together in a large crowd at the bandstand. And we knew very early on that there were a number of groups who were intent on coming, small number of groups, but who were intent on coming, who were absolutely not there for the kind of respectful and peaceful and not risky in so many ways scenes that we saw earlier on in the afternoon, but would absolutely want to gather people into a large crowd. So it was not likely to be practical. And actually the moment where the local police were informed, it's worth remembering just how fast this all happened in terms of the 3 days before the vigil. The local police, as they always would, it contacted the Central Command to say, people have come in and asked about doing something like this. I can't remember the exact words. And as they always do, particularly in the time of COVID, they refer that to the Central Command, and they would if it was anything at all complex or different from what they've been dealing with before. But all the COVID events have been referred to the Central Command, who came and worked with the local team and indeed engaged in multiple conversations with Reclaim These Streets. Louisa, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. So, as the Commissioner said, that there was a very short time in which to address this matter. Reclaim These Streets first contacted the local team on the evening of Wednesday, the 10th of March, and at that point, their extensive advertising had led to more than 2,000 people expressing an interest in attending. That number increased to nearly 6,000 by the Friday. at that first meeting on Thursday the 11th, both local officers raised some concerns about the compatibility of any event with the all-tier regulations. And I think you mentioned in particularly what the perceived difference between the local officers and our HQ. And now HMIC looked at this specific point, and they did not consider our central command as unreceptive, uncooperative or insensitive, but actually faithfully pursuing a policy of consistency, which HMIC broadly supported. And also, when they looked at our decision-making about whether we could allow an event to go ahead, they were very clear that there were clear reasons, as the Commissioner said, why it was not a realistic option. And they said that we, on balance, we acted appropriately in taking our starting point, a desire for consistency. They were very clear, and I'm sure you might want to ask about our interpretation of the regulations, that we did satisfy all the requirements of both considering the all-tier regulations, but also both Article 10 and 11 of the Human Rights Act. Their conclusion was that our thought processes and actions satisfied all of those requirements.
If I could just add, the last thing is the organisers on a number of occasions asked for a guarantee of no prosecution, and that is just not something that the police service can do before an event happens. It's just not possible. We couldn't possibly give that guarantee.
Did local stakeholders, or did they not, tell you that whatever happened, there was going to be some sort of vigil on Clapham Common?
I think we all knew that something was likely to eventuate, not least because by the time the organisers were speaking to us, as Louisa said, it had been widely advertised. So it was quite plausible that some people would still come. And indeed, people came for 6 hours in the afternoon and laid flowers very respectfully and with no issues at all. But we always knew that it was perfectly possible that other people would come in the evening. And, of course, it was possible that they might gather. We will never know, but my own view is that the organisers decided on the Saturday morning to say that it wasn't going ahead, reduced the numbers hugely, and therefore reduced the pandemic risk.
It was, of course, an essentially peaceful vigil. Very many women in London and elsewhere felt very strongly about what had happened to Sarah Everard. Duchess of Cambridge attended the vigil, which is relatively unusual for a vigil of that nature, which points to its essentially peaceful nature. But can I ask you, what steps did you take? What steps did you and your senior officers take to engage with the organisers of this peaceful vigil and explain how it could proceed lawfully?
Well, I'll ask Louisa again to answer that question. Suffice to say, I agree totally with you that in the afternoon, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people came over a 6-hour period, and the police presence was extremely low, and there simply to reassure and help people if they needed any help, and there were no issues at all. At about 6 o'clock, there was a massive change when people brought people together in a large, very densely packed crowd around the bandstand. But I'll ask Louisa to talk about the engagement with the organisers, which was extensive.
Thank you, Commissioner, Chair. So Reclaim These Streets first contacted the police on Wednesday the 10th in the evening, and there was a first meeting on Thursday the 11th where we raised some concerns about the organisation of a vigil and the compatibility with the all-tier regulations. The Reclaim These Streets lawyers wrote to us also on the 11th, and we responded to them on the 12th. We had another meeting with them on the 12th, and you'll be aware that on Friday the 12th there was a High Court hearing which started at 3:45 in the afternoon, and we had a third meeting with them at 7 p.m. on Friday the 12th. At that point, the written judgment hadn't been received. In terms of allowing an event to lawfully go ahead, so at the time we were in Tier 4 of the regulations, and Tier 4 contained a general prohibition on gatherings of more than 2 people from separate households. And our assessment was that the vigil came within this prohibition, given its scale, timing and location. And Tier 4 contained no specified exception for protest. Now, a person attending a gathering in contravention of those regulations could be committing an offence unless they have a reasonable excuse. But in terms of the organisers asking us to, provide a guarantee of no action, the reasonable excuse is actually for an individual to set out if they face a criminal prosecution. It is not something the police can set out beforehand. Now, of course, in considering any event, we always consider whether our actions could lead to an interference with somebody's human rights, and our actions have to be necessary and proportionate. And it's not our place to decide if an event itself will be lawful or not. And we did take into account the Court of Appeal ruling, the case of Dolan, which did set out that the regulations are not incompatible with human rights, given that there is the possibility of someone having a reasonable excuse to be involved in a gathering. But actually also that case said that in the vast majority of cases, it may be that there is no reasonable excuse, and a powerful argument that the restrictions which were there to protect public health were in themselves proportionate. So that was our understanding of the law, and as I've said, HMIC felt that our thought process in concluding that what the organisers were describing as an event to go ahead could not go ahead lawfully in our view at that time. However, we were working with them as much as we could to talk about alternatives like lighting a candle on your doorstep, like other events that have gone on, like Clap for Carers. So we tried very hard, but in the time we had available, the numbers we anticipated attending on Friday, that those numbers had swelled to nearly 6,000. The very limited time available for planning, and the fact that our planning would require us to make some assumptions about who might be attending, along with organisers who whilst had done their level best to identify how they might marshal people, the actions they might take. Our assessment was that despite their best efforts, it was not anywhere near the scale required for an event of that size.
Well, just finally, the court hearing that you spoke about, which took place, I think, on Friday, it is true, isn't it, that the judge did not unequivocally say that the vigil was unlawful? So
Reclaim These Streets sought particular declarations from the judge, and the judge declined to make those declarations. He concluded that it was possible that the outcome of applying the relevant tests in relation to Article 10 and 11 of the Human Rights Act, so freedom of assembly and freedom of expression, was that a particular protest or demonstration should not go ahead, which Reclaim These Streets were seeking from us a guarantee of no enforcement or prosecution, and in light of our understanding of the numbers attending, we could not make that guarantee, and our assessment of the High Court judgment was that actually the judge was saying it's entirely feasible that our assessment might be a protest or demonstration may not go ahead.
But it might be. It wasn't unequivocally the case that this particular vigil was illegal. That's the point.
So I think the point there is that the law is really clear that there isn't a blanket ban on any kind of event, that the police must take into account people's rights under the Human Rights Act. and therefore you must consider every event on its merits, and you must, go through that decision-making process. HMIC looked very carefully at our decision-making and concluded that our thought processes and actions had satisfied all of those requirements, and that our conclusion that the event should not go ahead was reasonable.
And absolutely finally, are you then telling this committee that the Metropolitan Police did everything it could have done to work with the organisers?
Yes, I think we did, and more than that, I think we had, and the HMO report shows this, we had a reasonable and sensible and highly engaged approach. We had our top public order, the most experienced in the country and possibly the world, commanders engaged. The strategy that we worked to, the general COVID strategy and the specific on the day, was good. We had a strong team. The planning and the engagement with the organisers, and I'll come back to that, was good. And both the commanders in their decisions and indeed the officers on the ground who were subject to vile abuse and hostility, and some of them are very experienced officers that I have spoken to, said it was one of, if not the most difficult and unpleasant in terms of the verbal abuse they were suffering, events they've ever been at, acted really, really sensibly. We didn't just engage with the organisers, but we engaged much more widely, as you might expect. I personally and the Deputy Commissioner and one of my commanders, or two of my commanders, were very heavily engaged on the Wednesday, the Thursday and the Friday, talking to leaders in London, talking to City Hall and talking to Home Office and indeed ministers at the Home Office about, of course, all the events, the terrible, terrible death of Sarah and everything that surrounded it, but also very specifically about this event on the Saturday. I probably put more time personally into talking to people about how this event might go and what we needed to do to try to get people to express their absolutely understandable and legitimate outrage, not just about Sarah's murder, but also about violence against women more generally. How could we channel that in other ways, in the sort of way that Louisa has said?
Thank you.
So I think we were very comprehensive in our engagement approach.
Thank you. Stuart MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. As I understand it, the HMI report did say that police can and should advise on whether or not enforcement action is likely to be taken. That seems a little bit inconsistent with what's been said earlier. It's not so much a question of whether or not there can be blanket guarantees of arrests and prosecutions, but advice could have been given about the likelihood of enforcement action. Was that sort of detailed advice given?
So yes, I think HMIC might be referring to our letter that we have a generic letter that we've used to do our best to explain very clearly the ill-tier restrictions and the regulations as we've gone through the pandemic, and to ensure that organisers have information. HMIC gave us feedback to suggest that we might set out in more detail what might constitute a reasonable excuse. We don't necessarily agree with that, because I think, having considered the law, our view is that, there isn't an exhaustive list of reasonable excuses, and there could be many. Having said that, in terms of our approach to this and ensuring that people have the best advice, our difficulty in working through this with the organisers is that they sought an absolute watertight guarantee that there would be no action taken against organisers or those present at the vigil, and that is something we could not offer, because our officers have discretion.
Okay, I get that, but did you say, for example, both of you have spent quite a lot of the last few minutes sort of saying everything was absolutely fine up until a certain point. Was that made no advance that, for example, families coming to lay flowers would be absolutely fine, no enforcement action would be taken at that stage, but, for example, speeches from a bandstand, at that stage we would have to consider intervention. Did that sort of discussion take place, or was it a blanket yes or no to the whole day?
The essential thing to think about here is gatherings and
Yes.
the COVID risk. These are not, rather obviously, these are not our regulations. These are the government and Parliament regulations. And as I said, we were, and still are, actually, even under the latest set of regulations, going many times a day to different parts of London where people have gathered potentially in contravention of the regulations. And that was a repeated, many, I can't say dozens and dozens probably of times a day during Tier 4. And the officer's job is to assess the situation and to engage with people, to explain, to say this is not actually allowed, as far as we can tell, what you're doing is not allowed under the regulations.
And I'll come to the huge. I'm absolutely happy to discuss the difficulties with the regulations and the lack of clarity there. But I'm getting to the point here. Is there something that could have been done better in the sense of, rather than just saying, nope, you're not having an event, having a more detailed discussion, which seems to be what that report was getting at, that says, okay, up to this point, your families come and laying flowers, no issues, police will not intervene, but if we get to a stage where there are speeches being made from a bandstand and crowds gathering, then we may have to intervene. That seems to be what the inspectorate report was getting at.
So, forgive me, if I may, I will bring Louisa in and she will answer your question. What I'm trying to say is the officers have to assess things, they then have to make some decisions. And if people disperse from what appears to be an unlawful and risky gathering, then that's absolutely fine. And they have the power to ask people to disperse. Enforcement action is only, in these circumstances, ever taken where people refuse to disperse. They refuse to move. They are unwilling to stop the gathering. So that's what we mean by enforcement in this way, or where they are, refuse to accept a fixed penalty notice and don't give their names and address, in which case they could be arrested. But Louisa, to Mr. Blackford's question.
Yes, so what we can be really clear on is we will have explained to the organisers our 4E's approach, as the Commissioner has just said. So we will have set out that we would always seek to engage, explain, encourage people before any enforcement action is taken. That would have been very clear. I think our interpretation of the law is that it is not for us to define the reasonable excuse. So there isn't an exhaustive list of, of reasonable excuses for people leaving home and coming. So it is a matter for the organisers or those attending to work out what their reasonable excuse is. It is not something, it's very clear, for us to predetermine. So our difficulty with what you're asking is
I'll leave that there, but all I'm doing is flagging up the point that I think I'm quoting directly from the report here. Our position is that the police can and should advise as to whether or not a protest is likely to be subject to enforcement action. So what I want to get at then, so let's say I come to you tomorrow and say I want to have a vigil or some form of protest at a different park in London, slightly more notice this time, start of June. How do you go about engaging with me? What is it you would need to know from me to decide whether or not that gathering might be lawful?
So if we set aside the pandemic and all tiers regulations for one moment, so something we do with any engagement around an event is that we would always do our level best to explain the policing approach we would take. Often with larger organisations who come regularly to London to protest, we'll have an established relationship with our police liaison team where we might discuss, when they've disclosed the intent of their protest, we might set out any concerns we have and the likelihood of us seeking to impose any restrictions. And we would always seek to then communicate that very early. So if we were seeking to use sections 12 or 14 of the Public Order Act to impose restrictions on a procession or an assembly, the likelihood is that we would supply those in writing beforehand, and we would set out the circumstances in which people might find themselves liable to enforcement action or arrest. But as the Commissioner has said, we always take an approach of seeking to engage and explain and encourage people to comply.
Yeah, but in relation to, you put aside the COVID regs for a minute, but with them included, how do you go about making an assessment as to whether or not me and my colleagues would have reasonable excuse to gather. I want to get at how difficult a decision this is for you, how difficult a process it is for you, and what we as legislators might be able to do to make your position easier.
So I think the challenge there is that the reasonable excuse is for you to determine, not me, beforehand. And I think that is the challenge. However, we would do our best. So because of the complexity of the regulations throughout the pandemic, we have as soon as we have a letter that's published and available on our website that sets out the impact of the regulations for people seeking to protest or assemble, what that means. The National Police Chiefs Council guidance has been published and is accessible and widely available as well, and we've tried incredibly hard to be consistent, I think. But also what's really important is that we would always have a conversation with organisers, but also in our own consideration as to the police involvement, because many protests happen every day that have no requirement for police involvement at all. And setting to one side the coronavirus pandemic and the restrictions. However, we always consider the human rights element as well, so particularly Article 10 and 11. What's really clear in legislation, but also HMIC drew this out in their report, that we must consider every particular event, and that any restrictions we feel we should impose or any action we must take, which should be proportionate and necessary. But those are qualified rights, they're not absolute rights, and therefore it might be entirely proportionate to restrict those rights.
But for a while it seemed that the Met's position was essentially that any sort of gathering or protest wasn't sufficient to justify a reasonable excuse. You're shaking your head. But so how do you go about that exercise then? I mean, how do you decide whether or not you're going to support a gathering and work with organisers or not, as was the case here? So how did you make that call?
I do want to take it back to the Tier 4 regulations. As Louisa has said, a gathering of more than 2 persons is not allowed within the regulations, except for the exhaustive list of exceptions. So there are 20 exceptions, all of which have several subsections. Protest is not one of those. So here I'm trying to emphasise that for the period of Tier 4, tens and tens of thousands of people who wanted events in London have not been able to have them, including people who wanted to protest. Every day, people who wanted to have a protest have not gone ahead with it because they have realised that it is either irresponsible, socially irresponsible, or that they could find themselves subject to enforcement action. They haven't had their protests. A few people have come out occasionally, and some of those have just immediately dispersed when we've gone to speak to them. Others have been subject to enforcement action. I don't know whether any of those have subsequently said, well, I had a reasonable excuse, and they're going to claim that at court, which of course is their entitlement. But it isn't our job to look ahead and say that could be a reasonable excuse or that couldn't be a reasonable excuse. It really isn't.
You are then basically saying that you're still taking the approach that nobody can gather for a protest.
I'm saying, for example, if you wanted, as an example, you've wanted to protest, and
you would say you're not going to cooperate with me as the organiser because it's not allowed under the COVID regulations, and then you just leave it for me after the event if I was given a fixed penalty notice or whatever else to establish whether I had reasonable excuse.
I'm not saying that at all, but I am saying in any circumstances, COVID or otherwise, it's not our job to organise your protest. It is our job to engage with you, to explain the law, to explain how we work, to keep up a communication with you. But it is not our job to tell you how to do your event. And if you wanted to walk up and down outside Parliament with a placard by yourself, of course that would very obviously be lawful. But actually, a gathering, there's only in my own personal view, there's only very limited times when it is likely that any court would find that you had a reasonable excuse. But we must, when we're thinking about this, go through the balancing act of people's rights. And we did. And
what factors do you take? See, that's what I don't have a clue about. What is it you take into account when you're doing that balancing act? And by the way, I'm as critical of the position that we have put you in as I am of the actual decisions that you've made. That's what I'm getting at. What was the source of this problem? I don't understand how you make that decision, this balancing act.
So, within the HMIC report, it sets out a critique of the Gold Commander's balancing act in those, and was very supportive of that. That in balancing. So our presumption in policing is that people have the right to assemble, that they have a right to express their views, and therefore we would seek to not inhibit that right or interfere with it. But if we are considering any police action that might interfere with it, it should be necessary and proportionate. One thing we did take into account throughout the pandemic was the Court of Appeal case of Dolan, where the court has set out there were powerful public interest behind the restrictions, and there's also a powerful argument that the restrictions in themselves were a proportionate interference with rights because they were there to protect public health. However, we are very clear that it is not our role to ban protest. So whenever people came forward to suggest they wanted to hold a gathering during tiers 1, 2, 3 and 4, we would advise, because there's a general prohibition on gatherings of more than 2 in tier 4, it would be a matter for you as organiser to work out your reasonable excuse, and that you might face enforcement action, but would not prevent us.
Thank you. I'm conscious of your time, Commissioner. Stuart, are you all right to finish there?
Just one final question, if I may.
Very, very briefly, and I've urged our panel to give very short answers, because I do have another couple of final, just brief questions to put to you as well before you go.
Very briefly then, so you referred to the role and the engagement you had with Home Office and ministers and so on. So one newspaper report put it like this, and I'm quoting from a newspaper, a message was sent to all police chiefs making the Home Secretary's position clear. She had wanted them to stop people gathering at vigils. She also promised she would personally urge people not to gather, but she never did. To what was the engagement with the Home Office? Did the Home Secretary herself ask the police to stop people attending at these vigils?
So, as I indicated earlier, there was very extensive conversations between me, the National Police Chiefs Council at one point, and a number of different sort of leaders across London and at City Hall and in the Home Office. And it's worth pointing out that in the previous weeks, and indeed in the week after, senior politicians of several sort of flavours, if you like, have sent out very helpful messages to people that in the light of the pandemic, gathering for the purposes of protest is either unwise, or sometimes they've gone further than that. Please don't do it. And that's been really helpful for us, because we are, as you say, in a difficult position here. We're all trying to keep safe and keep people safe. And so we know that the people who have brought in the regulations, and the Secretary of State herself, of course, and indeed the Mayor of London, have generally not wanted people to gather for obvious health reasons during Tier 4.
But did the Home Secretary ask police to stop people attending at the vigils?
So I genuinely cannot remember what the message was that went out from the National Police Chiefs Council on the Friday morning. Suffice to say, it is true that there was a conversation which actually on that occasion did not involve the Home Secretary, but on the Friday morning, which is talked about in the HMI report, where there was a sense that ministers, and indeed later on I had a very strong sense the Secretary of State agreed, although with the my desire, which I've been, if you like, banging on about for a long period of time, which was to encourage people to find other ways to express their undoubted and completely understandable
but surely there's a difference between politicians discouraging people from attending protests and making clear what politicians, particularly a Secretary of State, thinks the police should do. I mean, that sort of infringes on your operational independence, does it not?
I cannot remember what the National Police Chiefs Council put out. I absolutely can't. nor would I ever actually discuss the sort of private conversations that I personally have had with either, in my case, I'm accountable to the Mayor and I'm his policing advisor, and in some ways I'm also accountable to the Home Secretary. So I don't discuss the details of those conversations. But absolutely, it would be wrong, in my view, for any elected politician to tell the police how to police a particular event. And that is why I was so very concerned by the way in which many senior politicians, not the Secretary of State, jumped to conclusions without knowing the facts afterwards and judged the way the police had acted, in my view, very hastily and in a way which could be, and indeed in some of the conversations I had with people, actually was designed to say, for this sort of cause, forgive me, but forget your job, which is to uphold the law impartially and, of course, proportionately and where necessary. But forget your job about being impartial. A group like this, you need to give them, let them do whatever they like. On the other hand, a group over there, I wouldn't like you to do that with. That is not the British model of policing and really concerns me. But it is great for policing to have the support of the Secretary of State or the Mayor in what we're trying to achieve. Absolutely it is. They shouldn't direct us operationally.
Can I just ask some quick follow-up questions then? You said earlier that the deployment of male officers was proportionate to your public order resources. What is the male-female officer split in your public order teams?
I have to come back to you, Chair, to give you an accurate answer. I don't know.
Do you have a sense of roughly ballpark?
I don't know. I've asked that question whether we had, an unusual number of either or, and I think it was about normal. But I'd need to come back to you unless you know, Louisa.
No, I'm afraid I don't know.
I mean, obviously, the reason I asked is, obviously, as Simon Fell raised earlier on, a lot of the concerns that were raised with us were around the impact of having a large number of male police officers in a gathering that was predominantly women. Did you, as part of your plan, recognise that if you chose to take enforcement action, that would mean you might well need to send in predominantly male officers into what had started as a vigil with predominantly women there, and in a context where the vigil or the protest was about violence against women, and obviously the awful circumstances, not just of Sarah Everard's death, but also of the arrest of a police officer, and therefore the context for deploying police officers for enforcement would be a much more sensitive one and potentially a counterproductive one.
I was not in command on the day. As you know, that's not our model. But absolutely, this is something we discussed the day before. I'm very proud of my male and female officers. I do understand the sensitivities. I do also understand, that the images in that context looked very powerful to people. Public order policing is, however restrained, which they were, however professional, which they were, can, as it were, be quite messy. We're hands-on when we arrest people, sometimes with multiple numbers of people, in order to keep them safe. So absolutely it was considered, but I've already told you that we and I decided that it was not appropriate for us to put all female or try to put extra female in there.
I understand that in terms of the practicalities of your policing decisions. What I'm interested in is whether that was taken account in terms of the decision about the proportionality and the effectiveness of enforcement decisions during that period when those things are being weighed up in the balance, given that, I think, the concerns that are being raised with us were not about whether there should be a particular approach to one group rather than another, about whether or not they were preferred, but that there was something about this particular context and a police officer having been arrested that would make you as a force take a different approach because of that context, not because of it being a favoured group or an unfavoured group, but simply because the context involving the arrest of a police officer would make those enforcement decisions more sensitive and the consequences of them more sensitive.
Absolutely, we were deeply aware of that, and I've spoken to many officers who were there, some of whom will tell you just how upset, angry, appalled, betrayed they felt by the events, Sarah's death. And they were absolutely not looking forward to, if you like, policing this protest, and they really didn't want to have to take enforcement action. And indeed, if you look in the Gold Commander's log and Silver's log, it's very clear that we set out to say we will do everything we can to explain and to engage and to encourage people, and we will be very slow, if you like, to move to enforcement action. That's very different from, for example, a group of protesters who are maybe hypothetically here every week, who encounter the police very often, who know all the rules and are actually just, as it were, waiting to get arrested. We would move through it much faster because of the sensitivities. We were highly sensitive to these circumstances.
But do you recognise the perception from certainly many of the people who gave evidence to us that actually often many people felt that sensitivity wasn't fully being taken into account? So, for example, Helen Lewis, the journalist, describes, I want to stress for anyone who wasn't there tonight, the mood really turned when the police decided to move in and disperse the crowd, particularly when they formed a ring around the bandstand. It was freezing cold. People would have drifted off home otherwise, I think. There was separately in the HMRC report itself, there's a description that the Bronze 3 commander deployed further officers onto the bandstand to bolster numbers and to have a greater capacity to employ the 3 E's. So at that point, that was the attempt to engage, explain and encourage. But it says when these officers went into the crowd, they met verbal resistance and were prevented from doing so. Now, that verbal resistance is clearly not acceptable or justified, but nevertheless, what I'm trying to get at is whether you would recognise the concerns raised with us that actually the nature of that intervention, even that attempt to put in large numbers of officers in that way to do the engagement, explaining and encouraging in that context could end up being counterproductive and end up being interpreted in a very different way, regardless of the intentions of the policing decisions.
You've put your finger on the challenge of public order policing. In very dynamic circumstances, commanders have to work out what is the best way to achieve a safe outcome. My own view is, and I think it's the HMI's view, is that they made good decisions, sensible decisions. They knew that they thought through some of the impact of potential decisions. I'm absolutely certain that if they had not gone in, actually that rally, which it was, would have gone on longer with a tightly packed crowd and a greater COVID risk. That's my view. But I do appreciate that the very fact, in any crowd, when the officers go in to try to, as you I think you're indicating, a rational thing to do, to try to talk to people on the bandstand who are the ones who are keeping people there, encouraging people there, having speeches, completely different from the peaceful vigil earlier on in the afternoon. Try to engage with them. That was a rational thing to do, but we absolutely know that going into a crowd can cause some people to get upset. Other people, when they saw the police going in, just began to leave.
Indeed, but I'm not questioning your point earlier about your operational issues in terms of male and female officers, but given that what the impact was going to be deploying a lot of male officers in those circumstances. And in that context, then, do you understand the way a lot of people felt watching what was happening and the way a lot of people did feel deeply concerned and the way it could increase distress?
I absolutely accept that some people may have been concerned about that. I also know that many other people who were on perhaps the further reaches of the crowd left when the officers went in because they realised actually, it is time to finish. And many, 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 many women came up to my officers and thanked them for the way they had conducted themselves. Many women and people who were there were appalled by the behaviours of other people, perhaps I don't know, but perhaps some of the people you're talking about who were, aggressive and hostile to the officers. I think it's extremely hard thing to second guess when you're looking back at it, but I'm proud of the way they responded, and I do think they took these issues into account.
Thank you. May I ask you very quick final questions? I don't know if you're able to just give me very quick answers on this, because I am very conscious of your time and grateful for your time. Some of the points we've raised previously with you in previous evidence sessions. Do you have a figure for the current proportion of new recruits who are black and ethnic minority, and also what proportion within that are black officers? Thank you.
So you may be aware, Chair, that I have set a very ambitious aspiration for the next recruiting year, not this one, but starting in 22, which is that we aim to have then, and it's very ambitious, but we aim to have 40% of our new recruits to be from what is crudely, but forgive me, black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds. And we are forecasting that by the end of this current year, we're forecasting for the first quarter of this year that we will be at 30%, which is a big hike up, as you know. We're currently recruiting about 6% in total only that are black. And for this current year, I'm looking for 8%. I can give you more, but I hope that's roughly what
it would be
about.
great if you could write to us, perhaps
Thank
with
you.
any further detail would be very
Certainly.
welcome. And then on the stop and search, obviously there was an extensive HMIC report into stop and search. Has the Met implemented all of the recommendations in the HMIC report?
We either have or are at a very advanced stage of doing so, and the same is true of the IOPC report. Indeed, many of the recommendations of both we had either already done or were just about to finish when the report came out. So we've accepted all the ones that apply to us, and we are a very long way down the road in the various different things in terms of training, de-escalation training, community involvement in training, a whole new way of training people to work with stop and search. In terms of scrutiny and accountability, we were already very strong, but we're doing more. Having the community involved in our work in a much more active way. This all forms part of my Deputy Commissioner's delivery group. He's got an action plan which is 50 strong, includes the Mayor's action plan, and those two reports. I'm very confident with where we are going with that.
Thank you. If there's any further information you can provide us with, or one of your team could provide us with the progress on the implementation on the HMIC report, that would be hugely welcome as well. Commissioner, Assistant Commissioner, we're very grateful for your time this afternoon. Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us. That concludes our evidence session. Thank you. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.